3 years ago, she sold her nights for medicine. Tonight, the rain still remembers the shape of that bargain. The hospital smelled the same as it had the first night: bleach, coffee grounds, and that metallic tang that clung to the back of the throat. Madison Blake sat on a vinyl chair by her father's bed, a paper cup sweating in her hand, and watched the slow rise and fall of the monitor. Her father slept in a way that made her chest ache, unsteady, fragile, like someone balancing on a ledge who still believed the ground would hold. "Do you want the pills now?" the nurse asked without looking up from the chart. She was efficient and kind in a way that felt almost cruel. People could be kind when they weren't the ones who needed to pay. Madison's thumb rubbed the rim of the cup. The pills had a name that cost more than any salary Mr. Blake had ever seen. She knew it. She'd learned to say it without flinching so the room would not feel smaller. Life-saving medicine for her father's failing kidneys. Insurance wouldn't help. The doctor had used the wrong verb, delay, and she had translated that to punish. She got a phone number from the nurse and a promise there was a shipment in the city if she could cover it by midnight. 2 words, overnight courier, sank like a stone. She left and walked into the rain. Anthony Pierce found her outside the emergency entrance, flagged down by the halogen light and the rhythm of the rain. He wore a navy coat that had seen better nights, his hair damp, the collar of his shirt darkened where the water had found the fabric. He smiled the way privileged men smiled, casual, as if kindness cost nothing. He'd been at the hospital earlier. His grandfather had stroke watch privileges. His family's philanthropy made it tastier for the hospital to keep a private room. "You're not supposed to smoke here," he said, though she wasn't smoking. His voice bent toward concern, as if concern could be purchased with looks and a borrowed umbrella. Madison had known who he was the way the city knows its landlords, by face and rumor. Anthony Pierce, an inheritance waiting to happen, good hair, a name on plaques and invitations. Her world had been a collection of smaller names, invoices, pill bottles, the way her father said her name when he thought she wasn't listening. But now she looked at Anthony and thought of a number on a ledger, a solution in a human shape. "You know me," she said. Her voice was smaller than she felt. "I do." He closed the umbrella over them both with a decisiveness that felt like an agreement. "What's going on?" she told him. She told him the price tag and the timeline and the way the word no from the insurance company had sounded like a verdict. She watched his face like a map, waiting for the terrain to change. His jaw tightened. He offered gently at first, to ask around his family's networks. He offered favors. He offered promises that sounded like currency. "I can help," he said finally, "but it's complicated. It has to stay quiet." Everything he said after that felt like a seal, not contracts or signatures, just terms delivered in a way that left no room for negotiation. He didn't say, "I'll make it public," or "We'll figure it out." He said, "This will be private." He said it as if that would make the medicine appear as if by magic. They met in hotels at first. The first night was a transaction wrapped in the thin velvet of pity and necessity. Anthony brought an envelope with a handful of receipts from discreet pharmacies, a credit on a card that made Madison's throat constrict. He sat on the edge of the bed and met her eyes like someone who wanted to make this as easy as possible for both of them. "You're worth more than this," he said, and Madison understood the line for what it was, an attempt to make him feel better about purchasing what she had to sell. The medicine arrived the next week. Mr. Blake's numbers nudged back toward hope. Madison watched the way her father ate soup that day, how his fingers, calloused from decades of small carpentry jobs, rubbed the rim of the cup. She wanted to inventory every small miracle like currency, the sound of the monitor, the smell of warmed broth, the sun through the hospital blinds. But the medicine came with a shadow. 2 visits turned into 2 texts, then 2 dinners, then an easy intimacy in places neither of them spoke about in the daylight. The lines that had been drawn as business blurred. Anthony had a laugh that slid into the quiet. Madison began to keep a spare sweater in the glove compartment of her car. They learned the rhythms of each other, the way he read when the city felt too loud, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when nervous. Transactional details became tenderness. She taught him to make soup. He told her stories about the places his grandfather had taken him as a child, the medicine bedrocked itself into their private economy, and something like love began to accrue interest. This is how bargains mutate. What begins as rescue becomes claim. Madison found herself shaving her words, making space for the life he was not offering her publicly. He had a fiancée. An engagement to a woman named Gabriella Wyatt had been announced in society columns with photos of bouquets and white gloves, but those invitations were pages in a diary that belonged to everyone else. For them, the calendar was empty where it mattered, private as a handwritten ledger. Anthony insisted it would be temporary. "We'll figure out a way to make it right," he'd say on nights when the city hummed like an engine beneath their feet. He meant, some nights, that he would leave someone. Other times he meant nothing at all. He lived with the economy of deferred decisions. Madison counted the days between promises and began to keep a careful ledger of her own. Pills bought, nights spent, moments stolen. Somewhere along the way, however, the ledger stopped feeling like survival and started to feel like betrayal. She became pregnant in a June that smelled like cut grass and desperation. The first time she told him, he made the sound of air leaving him, a small, involuntary vacuum, gone as quickly as it came. He was at her kitchen table then, the light absolute against his profile, his hands small and fidgeting with the salt shaker, as if it were an instrument that could be tuned. "Are you sure?" he asked, which was both a request and a question he had already answered for himself. "Yes," she said. She watched him as if watching could pin him down. There was a kind of currency in the word, too. The child would be proof, an unassailable record. It would either make him brave or make him run. He didn't run immediately. For 2 weeks he was there between the lines, attentive, navigating his life with a gentleness that made her believe for brief shining moments that promises could be kept. He held her in the hospital corridor when she needed an ultrasound and hummed tunelessly while her father slept. He read articles with his face close to hers, shyly interested in potential names as if naming were staking a claim. For both of them, the future reorganized. And then the rest of the world reasserted itself with a delicacy that was razor-sharp. Engagement planning continued publicly. Photo shoots were scheduled, dinner parties where speeches were made about alliances and merging estates. Gabriella Wyatt became the public story. Madison remained the footnote. Money has a way of translating love into logistics, and the logistics of the Pierces and the Wyatts were already arranged. Wedding planners, corporate synergy, stock options littered like confetti. The night she chose to pull away from that tenderness in search of honesty, she did it in front of everyone. The Blake birthday dinner was supposed to be a modest affair, family and close friends in the kind of restaurant that smelled like lemon and oak. But for the Pierces it was a theater. Anthony arrived with a presence that filled the room. Gabriella's smile was the kind of polished tilt that shone and cut. Madison told herself she was going to stay in the kitchen, in the place where she could wash dishes, where shame could be hidden beneath suds and steam. Instead, she walked into the dining room because her father's hands had asked her to. He had looked at her with a softness that felt like home and called across a crowd to introduce her as his daughter. The words were small, but the room went still the way snow silences sound. Anthony's posture drained of warmth as Gabriella's eyes moved like knives. Madison saw the look he gave her, brief, so quick she could have missed it if she wasn't already waiting for signposts. He touched Gabriella's arm as if to remind her he was theirs. Madison felt like an extra in a play the casting agent had forgotten to tell her about. That night, a waiter dropped a cake with the flame of a single candle, and Madison realized she had become the spectacle of their gentility. She sat across from her father and watched the family she had bartered with look at her like a mistake. Gabriella's laughter was sharp, Andrew's jokes softer than his brother's, Avery's eyes like a challenge. Anthony moved through the crowd with practiced attention. When he reached their table, he placed his hand where her shoulder met her neck and said, "Everything okay?" As if the question answered more than loneliness. She told him then, in a voice that steadied with the truth. A little one was growing inside her. She wanted to keep it. The room orbited. Her father just held her hand, as if the contact might be contagious and pull everyone into the same gravity. Anthony's silence stretched. Somewhere outside the restaurant, a delivery truck clanged, an ordinary sound where ordinary decisions were made. "I can't leave Gabriella," he said finally, like a verdict. "There are consequences." He didn't explain which consequences were heavier, Public shame, family ruin, or some new tax the world would levy for shaking the plans of men who had never been denied. She felt something in her chest shift. It was small at first, like the way a window responds to a storm, and then it was a collapse. "You could try," she said, "because rage tastes better when you can make it practical. You could be honest." "I'm trying to be careful," he said. "I'm trying to—" "Madison, you have to understand what this means." What it meant was everything. A life with her child on the outside of the glossy windows, never the headline, never the photograph. She had traded dignity for medicine once. She wouldn't trade a child's right to an honest father. When she left the restaurant, the rain was waiting, as if the city had been keeping a slow vigil. The women in their coats floated past, their conversations a ribbon in the air. Madison's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. A picture of a bouquet and a ring. "Congratulations, the world congratulating the arrangement." She pressed the call button and let it ring without answering. That night, after the taxi dropped her at the apartment she shared with her father, the wood floor creaked under her feet. Familiar objects, her father's old newspapers, a chipped photograph of her family, sat like witnesses. She held the positive test at arm's length, as if it had the power to rewrite wrongs by the force of her will. Forgiveness didn't clean anything, and promises made men who'd never been held accountable for anything feel like brittle paper. She fell asleep with the sound of the city murmuring through the cracked window and woke to a message she hadn't expected. A meeting request with Anthony, clear and clinical, time and place, and no room for argument. He met her at a coffee shop that smelled like roasted beans and corporate negotiations. He wore a suit that had been carefully chosen to understate wealth. There was no apology in his posture. There was the kind of regret that felt rehearsed. His eyes, however, betrayed him. When they met hers, they burned with a mixture of tenderness and something raw. "We have to think about everything," he said. "The family, my father. If this comes out, it will ruin more than me." "And what about me?" she asked. "What about what I'm trying not to lose?" "You can't be the reason I lose everything," he said. "We can make arrangements. You can lie," she finished. "You can push me away, say I was never real." He reached out but stopped when his hand hovered over hers, as if touch was a currency he was unwilling to spend in public. There was a decision in his breath he couldn't reverse. The thing about bargains is that sometimes the buyer decides they no longer want what they bought. Weeks folded into a blur. Anthony's attendance in Madison's rooms became sporadic, then rare. Messages went unanswered more often than not. She watched the clock more than she slept. Meals started cooling on the table while she waited for his silhouette to darken her threshold. Her father's health oscillated. The monitors were faithful as anything made of wire can be, but their rhythms were not promises. Madison's pregnancy grew in the span of days the way a storm builds momentum. On a cold afternoon, Anthony came and said the words that would never leave her like glass embedded in the skin. "I can't get involved. I can't make this public. I have to think of the company, the marriage, my family. I'm sorry." "Is that love?" she asked, and she forced the question to cut cleanly. He didn't answer. He offered money instead. A trust fund suggested for the child, an account opened under her name. He tried to make kindness of practicality. She held the envelope as if she'd been handed a gift-wrapped acquittal, and felt nothing but the weight of compromise. The thought of surrendering the child to the ledger made her taste bile. She walked away. She packed a small bag and drove into the gray of the afternoon as if escape could be plotted on a map. She called Mr. Blake and told him to rest. She called Anita, the neighbor who'd been like a second mother, and asked her to come over. There was a plan in the way she moved now, not reckless but resolute. People who have been reduced to bargaining stop bargaining when it comes to their children. The world responded with cruelty that wears a polite face. At work, rumors crept from lip to lip, gossip the color of polished stones. The Pierce family's network could always find a seam to slip a story into. Madison found herself in a meeting with a photographer who took pictures like theft. One focused image of a pregnant stomach and a man's shadow crossing in the background could become a headline if someone decided it should. Then came the night that rearranged everything. It began like a curated horror scene. A warehouse on the city's edge with a series of crates and industrial fans and the smell of oil and rust. It was the kind of place where plans that demand privacy go to live. Madison had been offered a meeting, an opportunity to discuss legal arrangements, a supposed chance to secure the future for her child. She thought she was being cautious. She told her neighbor where she was going. She walked into the warehouse with a phone that felt heavier than it should, and a heart that believed in soft things. The man who met her there was not Anthony. At first, Madison thought he was a courier, someone small and pegged into the machinery of the city's errands. His face was mostly shadow. He spoke with a voice that had been taught to be unremarkable. "We'll need you to come with us for a few hours, Ms. Blake," he said. There was no menace in his words. There was the assumption of compliance. "Why? Who are you working for?" Her pulse accelerated. She looked for the door she had come in, for the beams of light through the sides of the warehouse, anything that could be a way out. The phone in her pocket felt suddenly like a paper of tissue. "Just questions," he said. "We'll bring you back." Someone had her hand before she could lift it to dial. The touch itself was clinical, one practiced hand that took the movement as if on autopilot. Madison's breath sharpened. She scanned the faces for the feature that would make this an accident, a slip, a wrong number, a miscommunication. There was none. Behind the small group of men she saw a silhouette framed in the light slanting through the high windows. Avery Pierce. His smile cut the same thin line as the city's skyline. "You misplaced a file," he said sotto voce, as if the intimacy of the lie required theater. "We're taking you somewhere safe." Madison fought. She kicked. She yelled the kind of names that have no audience. Her phone was taken. The city's noise turned into a tunnel. Hands moved like clockwork. Someone pressed a hood over her head. The world contracted into darkness, and the smell of oil and the sharpness of breath. Her mind catalogued things the way it always had, details, faces, names. It kept track because that's what keeps people alive. She did not scream out for Anthony. Part of her, some stubborn light, believed he would come. But the lights in the warehouse turned to lanterns, and then to nothingness as men moved like authorized shadows. Someone started a line of crates alight in a bit of showmanship that felt too much like a pyrotechnic rehearsal. Smoke is a strange animal. It moves with patience and intent. Madison coughed and tried to pull the hood off, but the voice, Avery's voice, was a metronome in her ear. "Keep quiet. It's better this way." There was fire then, sudden and greedy. It found the cardboard boxes first, which screamed in a way that sounds like newspapers being set ablaze. Someone closed a heavy steel door, and the warehouse became a throat filled with smoke. Madison clawed at the fabric over her face, lungs burning from a smoke that tasted like wood and something else, grease, plastic. Her world narrowed to the frantic beat of her heart. She felt herself pushed into a niche, into a pocket of the warehouse where the flames had not yet licked. Concrete was cold against her back. The hood was pulled tighter, muffling the world. She listened for the sound of other bodies, the scuff of shoes, the command of men who had practiced violence in the language of transactions. The air became thick with decisions. And then, painfully brief, the alarm, an explosion of sound and light. An arc of flame leapt like a living thing. The warehouse answered with metal that shrieked in the echo of chaos. Hands were suddenly frantic in their efficiency. Grab, tie, push. The scent of burning cloth entered her senses. There was nothing soft about it. She could hear someone shout a name that sounded like her own, but it was warped and swallowed by the roaring. In a moment that would break the rest of her life, a boot hit her side. The world tipped. She felt the cold calcium of concrete slam into her back as men dragged her, and then the floor slid away. Santiago, the name of a man who had been a courier for days, cursed under his breath, and then both his voice and the sound of the world faded into hot, thick silence. When Madison thought of what followed, the collapse, the smoke, the single raw burn of panic, she found she could not hold it in a story. Her memory would file it as shards, a flashlight beam, the taste of ash, a face that had suited a life of etiquette now wet with genuine fear. She felt hands lift, and someone mutter orders that included words like cover, dispose, and no witnesses. The men moved with the thoroughness of those who clean after a storm. When the fire found oxygen, it devoured anything that could tell stories. Somewhere above the din, a voice, Avery's, cold and small, said, "Make it look like an accident." The last smell Madison registered before the hood went black with soot was the particular metallic tang of an idea being executed. She coughed, and the cough turned dark. The air felt like it was closing in on her, not from suffocation but from the pressure of being erased. The mind tries to archive the face of the man who delivers absence. It becomes a photograph in the skull. Outside, the city went on. Drivers didn't know the names of the people who were bargaining their lives in the spaces between blocks. A traffic light turned red. A train rolled by, and the rain that had been the chaperone of so much of her life quickened, as if the sky itself were trying to clean evidence. Anthony did not know yet that this night had been staged. He was at a shareholder dinner across town, where the chatter was lacquered with trivialities. He laughed when someone told a blunt anecdote, the sound a practiced thing. There was a photograph later, his smile in the dim light, an arm lightly around Gabriella. He had no inkling at that moment of what would become the axis of his guilt. Inside the warehouse, people moved like clocks, efficient and cruel. They stuffed blankets into a small space and prepared a facade. They had practiced the story they would tell, misplaced, untraceable, a tragic accident. The flames did what flames do best. They made everything look like fate. When the first responders came, they did what responders do. Triage, sirens, shouted names. But the warehouse was a carefully engineered scene. Someone had left a way for the fire to feed, and the structural supports to give in just enough. The men who had orchestrated this had spent long hours in back rooms, drawing diagrams and making calls, rehearsing alibis until their voices had taken on the sound of certainty. Madison's phone lay dead on the concrete. Somewhere in the city, a text was sent from a number nobody maintained which read, "She was unaccounted for, fire, no bodies found." It was precise. It was tidy. The word presumed always makes stories less brutal to tell out loud. At dawn, the hospital's corridor smelled like coffee again. Mr. Blake slept and woke and slept, and the monitor tracked a heart that kept insisting on rhythm. Madison's chair in the apartment had been left empty. Newspapers would soon begin to print the sentence that had been rehearsed. A young woman, missing after an industrial fire, presumed dead. Anthony's life folded into the moment like a soft shirt into a drawer. He received the news in a way that made the world tilt. He had been insulated from consequence for so long, he had ceased to recognize it as a thing that could exist. Guilt, when it found him naked in the middle of his home, hands shaking over a champagne glass he had drunk from only an hour before. The news delivered itself into his skull like a slow drip. He felt something break inside him, less like remorse, which is tidy, and more like an animal that knew it was hungry and had suddenly lost its food. He replayed their last arguments. He opened his phone and scrolled through messages with the devotion of a morning person. He called people. He demanded information. He did not understand how one life could be removed as cleanly as a receipt until the edges had been burned. The ledger refused to answer. At the Blake residence, a grave was not yet dug. There were rumors, of course, that the fire had been an accident, an electrical fault, a stray cigarette. But for Madison's father, and for anyone who felt like the truth could still be something to chase, the questions remained. Someone whispered a conspiracy theory like a rosary: arrangement, jealousy, elimination. The Pierce and Wyatt names were sometimes whispered with the same caution one uses around a loaded thing. Outside, the rain washed the streets. Inside, people rehearsed their faces. The Pierces and the Wyatts issued statements with the tone of practiced sorrow. "We mourn what could have been," read the letter from a publicist. It did not mention the bargain. It did not mention the nights traded between hospital visits. It did not ask why a young woman had been alone in that warehouse instead of with the people who claimed to care. Madison's absence became a thing the city filled with a dozen versions of a narrative. Some said it was tragedy. Some said it was consequence. In the quiet place where her father sat and listened to the monitor, he named tragedies like items to be catalogued. He kept calling her name because names are a way to keep people from slipping fully into the past tense. For Anthony, the absence recalibrated everything he had been willing to tolerate. At family meetings, the conversation shifted like tectonic plates. Guilt became the new currency, and no one wanted to trade in it. There were quiet punishments, exclusion from small decisions, cold shoulders where there had been applause. The elder Pierces spoke in clipped tones about repercussions and reputations. Consolation is sometimes a performative thing when the stakes are someone's name. But guilt had a way of taking a man to places decisions could not, and Anthony found himself flailing, angry, raw, and unimaginative about redemption. He began to drink in private. He tried to atone in ways that were small and ineffective. He went to the warehouse with a promise of truth that fell short because the men who orchestrated that night had already scrubbed the surfaces clean of confession. He offered money. Nobody wanted to take it. He offered apologies that came out as questions. Each attempt was a stage in the slow theater of his remorse. Madison's story in those weeks lived in the rumor mill, a character in other people's tales. But grief is unkind. It hardens where it touches. Her father learned to be stoic. Her neighbors took up the care of small things. The police file thickened with interviews. Somewhere in the margin, a detective circled the names of the wealthy family and paused. There were whispers of friends who knew of Anthony's visits, and those whispers coalesced into a suspicion which was only the foundation for what would later become evidence. The thing about being erased, Madison thought in the few mornings she wasn't sleeping, is that it gives you time to change the ledger in your head. People who are presumed dead have the strange gift of being able to observe their own absence. They become, in imagination if not in fact, the author of their rewriting. But that is a later story. For now, smoke became rumor, and the city carried on. Contracts were signed. The Pierce-Wyatt engagement continued because institutions do not stop for absent women. Anthony told himself he was punished enough by the weight of his conscience. He allowed his life to slide into a groove of public grief and private torment, thinking that would be the end of the story. On a wet morning some weeks later, Madison's father looked at the chair by the bed and mouthed her name once, like a benediction. He did not know a truth that would be revealed in time, if truth ever arrives in full, unfiltered. He did not know that the person who left that night was being counted by men who had reasons to make sure she remained a rumor. Madison's last memory of the warehouse was a quick, impossible image. The way a hairband slipped from her wrist as men dragged her into shadow, the small clack of it against concrete. That hairband would later be one of the fragile things that didn't vanish. A tiny object that kept a story alive. The sort of detail that survives when people are determined to uncover what the powerful try to bury. The city cleaned up. The headlines printed what could be safely printed. Anthony leaned on his family's version of morality and tried to fold his chest around the memory like armor. Gabriella wore black at the funeral and cried in pictures taken by cautious photographers. The world took its photographs, filed them, and moved on. But bargains never erase entire histories, they only fold them into other paper. Somewhere, in the ledger of the world, a debt remained unpaid. If this story is gripping you, and you want to see where the debt leads, subscribe to follow the unfolding chapters. There will be more, because some promises require a reckoning. After the funeral, life tried to pretend the page had been turned. Madison's father returned home with a hollow that made his hands tremble. Neighbors left casseroles and condolences. The police operated on threads, and then on leads, and then on the reality that sometimes the wealthy can make the theater of an accident look convincing. But Detective Harris was not the sort of man to be satisfied with tidy answers. He kept a printout of the warehouse rental contract and circled an unusual clause in red, one that tied the location to a shell company with Pierce connections. He wasn't loud about it. He kept the note in his drawer like a small lamp. Meanwhile, the life of Anthony Pierce reorganized around ritual and self-punishment. He visited the places where he and Madison had once sat, like a penitent without a church. He tried to be better in public, but the private was a different sentence: wither and burn. At night he found himself waking to dreams in which the hood came off and her face hovered in the air like a photograph. He would then reach for the hole she had left and find nothing but the sting of regret. For Madison, whether truly alive or not, the world could not yet name, those days of erasure were a kind of crucible. The mind that survives a fire hardens in one of two ways: it collapses inward, or it shapes itself into armor. Madison chose the latter somewhere between the breaths. In the dark, if there was a dark left to her, she rehearsed a plan not for returning to what had been, but for returning altered, a person who could not be summoned away by the blandishments of power. But that plan required patience, and patience is a long conversation. The city's memory is not kind to non-events. If no one looks long enough, ordinary time smooths out the edges. People who survive disappearances learn to leave signatures, small, stubborn marks that say, in effect, I did not vanish. The hairband in Madison's memory was one such mark. So were the recipes she had taught a neighbor and the notebooks with her handwriting in the margin. These things mattered because, in an economy where evidence is always negotiable, the smallest proofs can be currency. There was an image that would haunt the next months. A photograph taken from a security camera across from the warehouse at the exact second the flames took the night. It captured a pair of figures moving away from the structure, one thin, one thick-shouldered, walking toward a bus stop. The photograph was grainy, but it looked like cinema when played at normal speed. Detective Harris enlarged the image and traced the features with a type of devotion that could pass for prayer. One figure was turned enough for a profile that suggested a jawline he had catalogued in other photographs, Avery Pierce. The other figure's face was obscured by the hood. It was not proof, but it was enough to keep questions open. As weeks bled into months, a strange reorder began. Madison's absence created a perimeter that people tested in different ways. Anthony's family worried. Gabriella feigned an innocence both natural and learned. The company press office drafted statements about being deeply saddened by recent events. But social grief is a scaffolding. It can be orchestrated. It can also be dismantled. In the quiet corners where human grief translates into action, other things happen. Madison's father, once a quiet carpenter who mended more than his own mistakes, started to keep notes, tiny scraps that recorded what she had done for him. When she had arranged the doctor, how she had smoothed his pillow. He kept them like relics, the way people keep rosaries, and in doing so, he kept some part of her alive. For Anthony, the days were an oscillation between attempted contrition and fatalistic self-preservation. He put distance between himself and the decision he had made, as if space could be a disinfectant. But distance is not a cure for regret. It is the perfect incubator for obsession. He started to wonder how far his culpability stretched, whether the ledger would ever balance. There were nights he smashed his fist into pillows so hard he woke with the taste of copper. He spoke little of the warehouse when his family was around. He visited, in secret, places the two of them had loved, leaving flowers at a bench by the river that they had once shared. He tried to atone with gestures that did not add up. The city continued to call itself civilized. Contracts got signed. The Pierces strengthened their public profile because institutions learn to act quickly when reputations are at stake. People told themselves they had done what they could, which is a common human defense. But the question of what to do about an absence lingers in the way ghosts linger, quiet and often ignored until someone with the courage to ask begins to look. The months that followed sharpened the readiness of the people who had been wronged. They learned to catalogue small anomalies, a receipt out of place, a message unsent, a driver's license that didn't match an alibi. They stitched themselves together with the smallest stitches of evidence, and those stitches make the most tenacious traps. Madison's story had not yet finished. Even when the city accepted a version of her absence, there were corners where stubbornness and grief refused to submit. The world has a way of hiding certain debts in plain sight until the person owed them decides to call them in. She was owed not only truth, but dignity, and debts have a way of compounding. The ledger was not yet closed. The signatures on certain pages were still wet with ink. Somewhere, in the slow calculus of things, accounts were being recalibrated, and when a woman who had been assumed dead begins to collect power, it is not usually to return to the small things she had before. It is to ensure she will not be bought again. 3 years later, the city no longer remembered Madison Blake as someone to be pitied. The papers had moved on, the memorials had been folded into archives. What the world called closure, she called an account settled in the wrong currency. She returned with a ledger of her own. They called her Belle White now, a polished silhouette at the head of an investment firm that had appeared almost overnight, with funds routed through islands and shell companies nobody wanted to trace too closely. Belle moved through rooms like a verdict, precise, unhurried, impossible to argue with. Her hair was held back with a simple band, the color of onyx, and she favored shirts with cuffs that hid the scar along the inside of her right hand. People were allowed to notice one detail and be forgiven for missing the rest. The first place she made them look was an auction house at the riverfront, glass and light, and the kind of crowd that breathed money. Tonight they were selling Shallow Bay Villa, the last great estate on the peninsula with the ocean view that could make a man feel entitled and small at the same time. Beneath the chandeliers, the wealthy moved like migrating birds, circling. Gabriella Wyatt was there in a dress designed to cut conversations short with its shoulders. Anthony stood a step behind her, a presence she had once occupied not so long ago. He watched the room the way men watch tides, practical, wary. Belle arrived in a low car and stepped onto the marble like someone who knew exactly when to appear. She wore a coat that swallowed the air and a look that refined curiosity into calculation. Her entrance was quiet, but ripples followed. People glanced at the hand that adjusted the glove, at the band of hair that whispered against her wrist. The auctioneer warmed up like an athlete, and the gavel fell into its rhythm. Belle bid once for a porcelain vase, an irrelevant flourish meant to test the reaction. Eyes turned toward her. Small ripples became focused stares. Some recognized a name she had bought years earlier in anonymous filings. Others saw a stranger with a checkbook that would not flirt with small sums. When the lot for Shallow Bay Villa came up, bidding began politely, then sharpened. Men spoke numbers as if reading off page proofs. Gabriella lifted a hand in practiced nonchalance. Anthony watched the way she did it and the way the room answered. Belle bid with a calm that suggested boredom rather than aggression. Numbers climbed. She knew the value of drama. She bought it when it was cheap. At one point, an old habit nearly betrayed her. A small, familiar movement as she pushed a loose strand of hair back. The band that had held it snapped off and fell into the leather of the bidding book. It was a tiny thing, nearly invisible unless you were attuned to unimportant objects, but someone took note. The band clacked like a secret on the auction floor, and then was swallowed by the sound of the gavel. Belle won the villa. The audience applauded a purchase they assumed was another play of wealth. Anthony's face, caught in the light, registered a flash that had nothing to do with aesthetics, an animal stirring in a cage. When she passed him, it was as if she walked from shadow into light. He smelled the faint perfume of citrus and something that unsettled him, purpose. She let the corner of her mouth lift at nothing in particular, a small private line of triumph. After the auction, a charity reception convened in a glass atrium. Belle navigated it like a diplomat with a pulse of steel. Alexander Dalton, the eldest son of the White family who had been a quiet presence in the firm's early meetings, stepped into conversation on cue. He was steady in a way that made others feel slightly rushed. His smile promised a kind of safeguard. "I'm glad you came," he said, voice low, the kind that contained offers and restraint. He had a hand extended the way someone offers an umbrella in a storm. "You made it easy," Belle replied, and the sentence held both gratitude and an absence of need. Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he'd been given a puzzle and liked what it promised. Across the room, Anthony caught sight of the small black band in Belle's gloved hand. The sight sent a current through him so sharp he felt his knuckles whiten on his champagne flute. Small, private objects were the architects of guilt. He tried to imagine where that band had been 3 years ago. The hair it had kept from tangling as she cooked soup in a tiny kitchen, the way it had slipped free in a warehouse. He tasted iron on his tongue and did not know how to spit it out. Belle's public moves were surgical. Within weeks, White Corporation announced a redevelopment plan for Shallow Bay Villa that included an arts foundation and a new wing named after White heirs. The plan required zoning approvals and a partnership with the Wyatt Foundation, and the announcement was a direct invitation to the Pierces and Wyatts to negotiate. Belle engineered the situation so the conversation would be held where she wanted it, at a boardroom table she controlled, with cameras and shareholders invited, where stories would be recorded and every phrase could not be unsaid. At the first joint meeting, Belle sat at the head of the table like a conductor. Her voice had been trained to make things inevitable. Gabriella came with a smile practiced into armor, and a file folder bristling with legalities. Anthony entered with his usual composure, but carried the brittle quality of someone pretending a wound had already begun to scar. Avery hovered in the doorway, the kind of animal that smelled advantage and licked its lips. Belle's opening remarks were short. She outlined a timeline and a vision, and then set a price the Wyatt Foundation could not ignore. Her terms were reasonable on paper and ruinous in practice. Concessions that would shift the balance of Shallow Bay's real estate to White Corporation's favor. a renegotiation of a merger clause in the Wyatt family trust, a call for transparency that was a thinly veiled demand for evidence. She had framed the conversation to make the alternative seem not merely unwise, but untenable. When Gabriella challenged a clause, Belle offered a small smile and then produced, smooth as silk, a copy of a lease agreement that connected a shell company used 3 years prior to an account linked to a Wyatt associate. The room leaned in as documents did their work. Anthony's throat tightened. The air in the boardroom tasted suddenly like old receipts. Alexander watched Belle handle the situation and did not flinch. He was lending her not only a handshake, but a reputation. The pieces Belle dropped were not only legal, they were personal. At lunch, she ordered the same clear chicken broth her father had favored years earlier. A tiny ritual observed with a detachment so precise it made people feel they had missed the point. When Anthony requested a private word in the corridor, it was the smallest of storms. "Belle," he said, voice low enough to be mistaken for courtesy. Even now his attempts at closeness came out as speeches. "There are better ways to, this will ruin people." She held his gaze like a ledger underlined. "You shouldn't have left. You shouldn't have let them carry me away," she said. The words were economy. No excess, no flourish, just the blunt arithmetic of responsibility. His breath hitched. For a second, he looked as he had the day she told him she was pregnant, bareness and calculation. "We thought it would protect you," he said. "We thought—" "You thought what?" she interrupted. "That disappearing me would be easier than answering for your choices?" Anthony's hand moved as if toward hers, a gesture he meant as supplication. "I tried to make amends." "Amends don't rebuild lungs," she said. "They don't put back what was taken." He flinched at the tenor of her voice. In the hallway, the band on her cuff caught the light. She let it show deliberately, as if memory itself were no longer ashamed of small, honest things. Out in the world, rumors stitched themselves into something louder. A blogger, one of those hungry, efficient humans who read filings for blood, posted a grainy photo of Belle standing near the auction stage, one hand on the podium. In a caption, he wrote, simply enough to draw breath, "Who is Belle White?" The thread filled with guesses from anonymous accounts and investment analysts. Somewhere, a woman who had been counting small items as proof of self felt something in her chest reknit. The suspicion that Belle was Madison had roots in the small things people overlooked. A waiter who had once served her at the restaurant remembered a habit, Madison's way of stirring soup clockwise when nervous. A neighbor in the old building recalled a recipe left in a drawer after she disappeared, cut and marked in Madison's handwriting. Alexander, observant, noticed the slight curvature in the right hand that Belle kept hidden, a limp that looked like a healed tendon. Detective Harris, who had not been content with the original file, watched the corporate maneuvers with a private hope. His team had circled a handful of anomalies, payments, registrations, the security photograph from the night of the fire. He kept compiling small pieces the way an archivist collects fragments before a tapestry reveals its picture. When the first credible whisper suggested the Black-White Shell Company had purchased Shallow Bay, Harris made a call that would set in motion a public unraveling. The trigger came from an assistant who had once worked for the Pierce House and now worked for White Corporation. She was a small woman with the sort of face that remembered more than it said aloud. She had learned to speak in precise increments, nothing reckless, nothing dramatic, because survival in the corridors of power is a practice in measured disclosures. She delivered a short, trembling testimony to Detective Harris. Details of Anthony's punishment in the weeks after the fire. The ways the family had sequestered him from decision-making. The hush money that had been offered and refused. Her words were precise, not accusatory, the cadence of someone who had locked herself into a moral corner and now needed daylight. When the first subpoena for records arrived, it read like a finger pressed into soft earth. The account numbers matched. Shell companies linked to the Wyatt Foundation showed payments for consulting. A scrap of an email hinted at a meeting that had been not a rescue but a capture. The pieces were not yet a proof that would put a person behind bars, but they were enough to make reputations tremble. The day the DNA test was scheduled, the office where it happened looked like a bureaucratic theater. Laboratory technicians moved with the indifferent calm of people who witness life and death in test tubes. The sample sat in a plastic vial like a small truth waiting to be read. Anthony felt as if his head were full of 1,000 small hands, each one knocking a different rhythm against his skull. Gabriella stayed away from the building that morning, pale and unreadable, in an image that made for good footage. Anthony came, as if by duty, to the clinic and sat in a room that smelled like antiseptic and old coffee. Belle walked into the clinic without warning. She wore a dark coat and no attempt at concealment. Her presence was a message. She sat opposite him and did not speak. The technician opened a sealed envelope and read numbers like scripture. A hush fell with the seriousness of church pews. When the result was printed and the numbers matched, an alignment of chromosomes and the inevitable arithmetic of kinship, the paper felt like a bell toll. The DNA readout did what documents did best. It closed a loop the others had only circled. "It's her," the technician said, and the syllables landed with the weight of verdicts. Anthony's face drained of color. The world seemed to narrow to the round paper in the man's hand and the sound of his own pulse in his ears. The reporter outlets metastasized the line into headlines by noon. Belle White identified as missing Madison Blake. Social media did what it does best: amplify, simplify, judge. For Anthony, the public confirmation felt like a sharpened stage upon which his private guilt performed for millions. Gabriella's phones lit up with messages that had the blunt pang of accusation. Her denial came out as a practiced breath, but the eyes do not lie. Themselves the first casualties of a lie worn long enough. Private consequences had the rawness of an animal. Anthony's family convened in a room with varnished tables and voices heavy with expectation. His father paced like an old ship. Uncle's sentences of disappointment were issued in clipped tones. Anthony tried to speak and found his voice a foreign thing. "I never wanted," he started, and the plea was the sound of a man trying to stitch a torn thing with thin thread. "You never wanted to be truthful," Alexander said quietly, hands folded like a person who had been through this before. "There's a difference." Alexander's loyalty to Belle was not blind sentiment. It was a strategic alignment based on the facts he could read. He had been an ally at the auction, and now at the moment of reveal, he offered Belle counsel that felt like shelter. He offered Anthony something else, a contract of sorts. Step down from public directorships, a promise to give testimony, a public apology. Anthony, who had been protected by the family scaffolding for decades, found the scaffolding collapsing one beam at a time. But the public revelation did more than expose guilt. It stirred resentment, fear, and a kind of ruthless self-preservation among those at risk. Gabriella's position snapped like wire. She moved fiercely to protect what she saw as her future. She convened advisors, lawyers, associates who smelled a corner and thought to bite. In private, her axe became sharper, an attempt to stop the unraveling by any means that could be kept secret. The climax did not begin with fireworks or a dramatic speech. It began with a locked door and the sound of people who had lost their scripts improvising. Belle's team had taken a room in the old warehouse district to stage the opening of a foundation gallery at Shallow Bay, part reparation, part claim. The event was their public declaration: art, philanthropy, reinvention. The guest list was private, the architecture tasteful. Yet taste could not keep a desperate person from tearing at seams. Gabriella arrived at the gallery with a small group who smelled of determinism. She had been losing the narrative. In losing control, she became dangerous. She cornered Anthony in a small room meant for speeches and confronted him with the rawness of pain. The words spilled into their own violence. There were accusations of cowardice, of complicity, of taking what should have been hers. It escalated in a way that required witnesses to be credible. Someone in Gabriella's entourage, someone who had watched her with the tenderness of adoration turn into something brittle, pulled a gun, not intending to fire but to make the moment irrevocable. Panic made everyone sharp. The room became a pressure cooker. Guests pressed against walls, breaths held. Security moved like trained fish, fast, efficient, human in the most mortal way. In the crush and confusion, Gabriella made a movement toward a table where a ceremonial sculpture stood. She grabbed a knife, metal catching the light. Her face was a map of desperation. "You left her," she cried. "You let them take her." Her voice was equal parts accusation and collapse. Anthony stepped between her and Belle without considering the arithmetic. He had not intended to be brave. He had meant only to stop a spectacle. The knife found him as if caught by destiny's cruel hand, swift, clean, another small thing that rearranged everything. He fell, blood darkening his shirt until it looked like a photograph of a life being edited. The sound of the impact of him hitting the floor made some people move as if a string had been plucked. Someone called for help. A security guard shouted for medics. Gabriella staggered and then sat down like someone who'd been offered a script she had not expected to perform. Her hands trembled. The gun clattered to the floor. Her eyes were wide with what looked like horror or calculation. The knife went still in the stain of his shirt like a punctuation mark. Belle moved with a speed that contradicted the composed exterior the world adored. She knelt beside Anthony, not as a woman stunned by his wound, but as one who had rehearsed 1,000 possible endings. Her hand hovered above his ribs, checking for a pulse the way someone checks the warmth of a commodity. He was alive, but the line between life and legend is always thin. "You could have saved me," Anthony whispered through the effort of breathing, his words doing the work of confession in the carnage. Blood painted the vowels. He looked up at her, and in that look was the summation of years, the bargain, the pregnancy, the warehouse. I didn't know how to be brave. No. Belle's face did not betray a single item of pity nor indulgence. She touched his forehead with a pressure that was both clinical and personal. "You thought silence would hide what you did," she said softly. There was no theater in the sentence. It was a filing of truth at the place where a heart continued to beat. The medics arrived and took control. They moved with protocols, but grief is not procedural. Gabriella was taken away in handcuffs, her explanation a stuttering litany of fear and misdirection. The cameras dematerialized the scene into 1,000 replays that would be watched and debated and reshaped into opinions. In the hospital, Anthony's blood-stained sheets in a way that would not wash from memory. He was conscious in phases, lucid enough to understand the gravity of the wound, clouded enough to dream. He confessed in fits of coherence, confounded apologies that were half prayer, half attempt to sedate conscience. Belle sat across from him in a chair so firmly planted that it looked like it belonged in a courtroom. Alexander had insisted on being present, his face the picture of a man who would give counsel but never pity. Anthony's family arrived in a silent procession, eyes raw. There was a pleading in his father's face that felt like a fossilized ledger made flesh. "You didn't have to do this," Anthony said when he was able, voice thin. "I could have." "You had choices," Belle answered. Her voice was even. "You made others make them for you." He reached for her hand as if reaching into an abyss. The gesture was human and ridiculous. It was also the only honest thing in the room. "Please," he said, "tell me I can make it right." Belle's fingers folded around his and then withdrew. To touch too long would be mercy. To leave too soon would be cruelty. The calculus of all she had done uncurled in the silence. "You can try," she said, "but some things aren't fixed by promises." The months after the hospital were a slow accounting. Anthony recovered enough to speak at a public hearing about the event, his words thin, strained by the knowledge that admissions could be weaponized. Gabriella's trial would follow, evidence compiled, witnesses called. The Pierce family's public hold on power frayed in ways that were messy and visible. Donations were rescinded by trustees who saw a stain and wanted to distance themselves the way one removes a soiled cloth from a table. Belle moved forward with the structural patience of people who know how to build legacies. She expanded the foundation at Shallow Bay, invested in the arts, donated to dialysis clinics and foundations that fought the disease that had nearly taken her father's breath away. There was a public narrative she cultivated, a woman who had suffered and now invested in the suffering of others. The press loved the arc. Viewers preferred scripts that fit them into comfortable endings. But Belle never allowed the narrative to fully settle where they wanted. In quieter rooms, she kept her ledger. She purchased the assets that had once been promises on someone else's resume. She cut deals and canceled others. She took the boards exactly where she needed them to go, bending corporate trajectories with the quiet force of someone who had been taught the lesson that power answers questions quickly. Anthony's rehabilitation was both physical and moral. He volunteered at centers, wrote letters, and met with families who had suffered from corporate negligence. In private, he did the most dangerous thing a penitent can do. He tried to live small. He moved away from the spotlight and let the scandal refine his edges. The wound in his side healed into a pale line, an anatomical punctuation of error. He kept that line hidden most days, visible in private baths of sunlight. Madison, Belle, kept what she had promised herself. She did not erase her past into a story of redemption with neat arcs. Instead, she used the past as both armor and tool. She barred the men who had orchestrated the warehouse from ever walking into her buildings again. She paid to support investigations into the shell companies. She funded scholarships in the name of her father. Her acts were not always forgiving, some were punitive, and she did not apologize for the coldness of justice. Forgiveness, if it ever came, would be on her terms. There were moments, infrequent and private, when Belle would stand on the cliff at Shallow Bay Villa and let the wind pull at her coat. The sea sounded the same way it had in her childhood, vast, indifferent, honest. She would hold the tiny black band in her hand sometimes and let it twine around a finger, feeling the small thing that had kept a story alive. The band was a relic and a warning. Be exact about what you hold. Anthony made attempts at reconciliation that were met with a measured refusal. He wrote to Belle with the sincerity of someone trying to pay debt without the means to settle it fully, a conversation that could not be reduced to neat paragraphs. He asked questions that came from the marrow. He sometimes showed up at public events where Belle was a patron, and they would exchange looks that contained a world of languages neither of them wanted to speak aloud. Gabriella's fate was less ambiguous. The hearing established culpability, though not in the eyes of some, the full extent of what had happened. The legal system was a blunt instrument for a sophisticated crime woven into the fabric of family influence. She was convicted of orchestrating aspects of the kidnapping and arson. Sentences were handed down, appeals filed. Public opinion painted her as the villain in a story that had been written in conference rooms as much as on violent nights. She lurched between indignation and acceptance, a woman who had once been sure of her future now forced to face the calculus of consequence. Uncle Benjamin's memory remained a motif that haunted certain pages. His absence still hung like a comma in family speeches. Mr. Blake grew older in ways that made Belle's chest ache. She visited him under the pretense of business sometimes, and other times simply to see the man who had stitched her to a life of small courage. He kept a folded photograph of her, older, softer now, on the nightstand like proof that someone had once been a child. He never learned of every deal she made. There are mercies that are small and ordinary. Detective Harris sat through the legal motions with quiet satisfaction. He knew the justice system had limits, that not all debts would be repaid in full. But the dollars rerouted, the companies dismantled, the testimonies that forced public admissions, these were victories in the narrow sense of someone who had been stubborn enough to keep looking. One evening, months after the gallery incident, Belle took a meeting with Alexander in a small office that looked out over the city. She set a tiny black band on his desk like an offering. He picked it up and turned it over in his fingers. "You could have destroyed them," Alexander said. He meant the Pierces, the Wyatts, the institutions that had nearly bought a life and then burned the receipt. "You could have made them disappear." She considered the skyline. "Destruction is wasteful," she said. "I prefer to collect dividends." He smiled at the bluntness. In that smile was an offer of partnership and an unspoken question of whether power was better exercised with the hand that punishes or the hand that builds. Belle chose both, and in doing so, she fashioned a future that was strategically cold and practically generous. Anthony watched her from a distance sometimes. He would stand on a balcony and see the figure with the band of hair moving through crowds, and would feel a small private grief. He had been the man who could not keep a secret, and who had thought secrecy the same as safety. He had been the man who turned away when a steak was asked of him. He now lived with the consequences, which was another way of saying he had finally been given a chance to learn the lesson that bargains have neighborhoods, people who live in them and pay the rent. The city learned a new story about courage and cunning, that someone presumed dead could come back not simply to haunt, but to govern. Belle White's ascendancy was not merely headline fodder, it altered the ecosystem of local power. People began to calculate differently. Deals were made in public and private with a new caution. The Pierces had to negotiate with a woman they had once minimized. For Anthony, the sensation of watching her succeed while he labored to atone was a particular kind of punishment. The final image of the saga lingered not in courtrooms or press conferences, but in a quiet place. Belle's office on the top floor of White Tower, a window that framed the ocean like an open ledger. She sat behind a desk with the hairband lying on a small dish, no longer a secret, only an artifact. The photograph of her father sat beside it, a reminder that power had come at a cost she understood intimately. Anthony's fate remained complicated. He would live, at least for now, but the wound had become a permanent index, a reminder of choices and their echoes. Whether he would be forgiven, whether he would ever manage to pay in a currency Belle would accept, remained a question without a neat answer. Belle had not sought vengeance for spectacle. She had sought a rearrangement of the balance of power so no one could purchase the erasure of another person ever again. That she had become untouchable in the process was a fact of strategic survival, not a satisfaction. When the city lights clicked on and the tide softened the shore below, Belle stood by the window and thought of bargains and the woman she had once been. She had been a secret once, a transaction no one wanted to claim in public. Now she owned companies and villas and reputations. She sat in chairs that once would have laughed at her. Power had not healed all the holes in her chest. It had preserved windows and given her the means to break some of the structures that allowed cruelty to be staged as fate. She turned the black band over between thumb and finger and, with an economy that had become her vocabulary, placed it on a page of a ledger she kept closed in a drawer. She did not forget. She had not sought to make everyone pay. She had only insisted that debts be acknowledged. There was an ache in the place where hope had once been whole. The world called her untouchable. The fact lived with the truth that untouchable does not mean unscarred. It means sometimes that survival taught you to build a fortress you are willing to sleep in alone. And then, in a soft voice that belonged to no audience but the room itself, Belle whispered into the dark. The ledger is open. If you want to follow what that ledger will demand next, the settlements, the betrayals, and the choices that will shape them, watch the next episode in the series.